Hello and welcome. I'm Shani Peer. I'm the director of the Maison Française at Columbia University. And I would like to welcome all of you to this discussion with Guillaume Lachenal about a medical disaster and its aftermath, the quest for sleeping sickness eradication in colonial Africa. Guillaume will be introduced shortly and properly by Thomas Dodman. So I will wait for him to make a proper introduction. I just wanted to thank all of our co-sponsors of this event. In addition to the Maison Française, this event is co-sponsored by the Center for Science and Society, the Department of History, Institute of African Studies, and the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities. So thanks to all our co-sponsors, thanks to all of you for joining us. There will be time for questions at around 3 o'clock or perhaps shortly thereafter. So if you have a question, feel free to put your question in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, or you can use the raised hand function to raise your hand when we get to the question and answer session. So without further ado, I will turn over to my colleague, Thomas Dodman, who's an assistant professor in the French department and history department at Columbia University, and he will take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Shani. Thank you, Fanny. Thank you to the Maison Française for hosting us here today. Thank you to the co-sponsors, indeed, to Guillaume Lachenal for joining us from France, and to all of you for being with us. Guillaume Lachenal is a university professor at Sciences Po in Paris, where he's particularly involved with the interdisciplinary media lab. He previously taught at the Université Paris Diderot. Medical historian by training, Lachenal's books and articles explore the history and anthropology of medicine in Africa from colonial times through to the present, with a critical eye and a sense of engagement and very much sense of urgency about the present too, I think. He is the author of 2 major monographs, most recently Le médecin qui voulut être roi sur les traces d'une utopie coloniale, published by the Seuil in 2017. A translation is forthcoming with Duke University Press and should be out in the spring, with the title probably The Doctor Who Would Be King, we'll see. Before that, Guillaume also published Le médicament qui devait sauver l'Afrique, un scandale pharmaceutique aux colonies, published by La Découverte in 2014, and recently translated as The Lomidine Files, The Untold Story of a Medical Disaster in Colonial Africa, published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2017, and the winner of the George Rosen Prize from the American Association for the History of Medicine just this year. It tells the story of Lomidinization, or mass campaigns to inject pentamidine, a wonder drug deemed capable of eradicating sleeping sickness in French, Belgian, and Portuguese colonies in Equatorial Africa during the mid-20th century. What could possibly go wrong with that, you might ask yourself, and you will be hearing a little bit about it today. This talk is part of a course on pandemics in Francophone history and literature that I am offering this semester together with my colleague Madeleine Dauby and our students who are here present today. Madeleine and I came up with the course this summer, with the idea for the course this summer in response, obviously, to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and a sense and a need to escape from the immediacy of the now, to put our time in context and give it both some historical depth and some representative breadth. Last week, we were reading Céline's Voyage au bout de la nuit, which, among many other things, is an onslaught of disease, illness, decay, and death, not least in the sections on colonial Africa. Next week, we will turn to Albert Camus' La Peste, ostensibly and realistically set in colonial Oran, of course. On December 1st, I should also point out, we will be having another public session, again, kindly hosted by the Maison Française, in which Madeleine Dauby will be talking with Véronique Tadjo about her book En compagnie des hommes, a timely fable about human beings and the natural environment during the Ebola outbreak of 2014 in West Africa. And that book too has a forthcoming translation to be published by the Other Press and should be out in February, if I'm not mistaken. Madeleine and I are very happy to be able to bring our course and these distinguished guests to the Maison Française's wider audience, and are very grateful indeed to the Maison for support in making this possible. So today, for the time being, we are in the mid-20th century, at least we start in mid-20th century French, West Africa and Equatorial Africa, for a talk titled, and I'll give you the full title because it was too long to put on the advert, but it is worth it. a medical disaster and its aftermaths, injections, iatrogeny, and the quest for sleeping sickness eradication in colonial Africa. So please join me, at least virtually, in welcoming our speaker here today, Guillaume Lachenal.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you to La Maison Française and all the co-sponsors for the kind invitation, and thank you all for coming to listen and discuss. It's a pleasure and an honor to give this talk, and I cannot even say in advance that I am as an advance excuse that I am jet lagged, because I'm not. I am in full mastery of my mind at this time of the day. So as an introduction, no, it's not yet shared. So let me share the screen. Yes. Okay. Yes, as an introduction, I wanted to say that contrary to what has been said to promote the talk is not about vaccination and vaccines, but I will explain the technicalities of the distinction. Also, I'd like to say that contrary to what's written as a subtitle of my book, the book is not either about an untold story of a medical disaster, because I believe there is no such things as untold stories by definition. And especially with this one, which is a story that has never ceased to circulate in Cameroon. But what I want also to stress is that the English title of the book that I will mostly present today, the Lomidine Files, is accurate and is better than the French one, because it is exactly what it is about. It's not only the story of a medical disaster, not only the story of a slice of the past, but it is also a reflection on the existence of this past as a file, as a set of papers, as an archive that is very much with us in the present, because also I believe by definition that there is no object of the past that exists without a mediation in the present. So I will nevertheless begin in the past, on a day of November 1954, in the far east region of Cameroon, close to Yokaduma. The rainy season had just ended, and the team number 15 of the Mobile Hygiene and Prophylaxis Service, the Hygiene Service, began its campaign in the village of Gribi, 30 kilometers north of Yokaduma. All the villagers, women and children included, gathered, as they did every year, for their injection of Lomidine, or pentamidine in the English-speaking literature. The preventive administration of Lomidine to entire populations was then called total Lomidinization. It was a priority and a source of pride for the post-war colonial health services. The technique's efficacy was unprecedented. A single injection of Lomidine conferred protection for several months against infection by a parasite named trypanosome, the parasite that caused sleeping sickness. Sleeping sickness was endemic in Central Africa, and even epidemic in Central Africa since the early 20th century, when the disease turned into a demographic crisis. Sleeping sickness was considered as the main obstacle to the economic development of the colonies, and the campaigns to control it became a matter of trans-imperial competitions, comparisons, and collaborations between European powers. Cameroon, which was a former German colony taken up by the French after the First World War, had been since the 1920s a laboratory for sleeping sickness campaigns, where a French approach to the control of sleeping sickness based on the screening and treatment of cases in villages by mobile teams. This French approach was experimented in Cameroon and showcased in propaganda pictures and films all through the interwar period. The situation was largely under control before the beginning of World War II. But by 1944, all of Central Africa, including French Cameroon and the Belgian Congo, for example, were on red alert. For local population, the war had been tough, meaning the return of forced labor and forced collection of, that was my picture, yeah, and forced collection of rubber in the forests. Rubber was needed during the war for the tires of Allied armies, and rubber collection in the forest by cutting trees and vines that secreted latex. Rubber collection was a well-known way to expose oneself to the tsetse flies that transmitted the trypanosome, and rubber collection during World War II, as it did in the early 20th century, led to severe outbreaks of sleeping sickness that were detected in Cameroon as early as 1943. Especially in the region of Yokaduma. In addition, after World War II, the growing political agitation, as the colonial authorities named it, of rising nationalist movements, independentist movements, led to what doctors saw as an epidemic of indiscipline. The repeated campaigns of screening and treatments, like the one shown on this interwar picture, became inefficient as people stopped to show up or simply fled in the bush to avoid the campaigns. Today, we would call this pandemic fatigue. In that context, the new drug, the new strategy of Lomidinization kindled great hopes. It was a quick fix to the epidemic, potentially, and a quick fix also to political tensions, because a single injection of the drug every 6 months, every year, every 2 years was enough to control the epidemic. So by 1952-53, after millions of injections in Central Africa, the cases of sleeping sickness became rarer and rarer. Infection rates collapsed, and for the first time, the eradication of sleeping sickness was within reach and even announced, such as in this paper of 1954. Lomidine was celebrated as a wonder drug, and indeed, no new cases of the disease had been reported in the area around Yokaduma in 1954, and it was as a measure of prudence, of caution, that the team 15 visited the village of Gribi to inject everybody. In Gribi that day, the team worked efficiently. In just 2 days, 4 nurses surveyed, examined, and lomidinized more than 1,000 individuals. At the time, most teams aimed to practice 1 injection per minute, thanks to heavily tailorized procedures. On the evening of November 13, after 2 days of work, the head of team, a European health assistant, not a doctor, by the name of Anselm, left the village of Gribi to spend the night in the nearby small town of Yokaduma, 30 kilometers away. An unexpected event interrupted his evening rest. A truck arrived carrying a resident of Gribi who complained of a painful abscess in the buttocks, which appeared to have resulted from the Lomidine injection. Anselm did not seem worried by the incident and kept the plan for the tour. The following morning, his team Lomidinized another 300 people in a neighboring village. Later that day, however, the news from Gribi was alarming. 3 individuals had died, and another dozen, all Lomidinized 2 days earlier, had developed worrisome abscesses. During the evening, a truck arrived again in Yokaduma. Its 21 passengers were in critical conditions. Their buttocks and thighs were very swollen, and there were signs of putrefaction and bursting in their muscles, Their general state was very altered, as the doctors would later note. During the night, 2 patients died. 4 or 5 fell into a coma. The death toll climbed by the hour. A catastrophe was looming and the diagnosis was soon obvious. The shot of Lomidine, prepared with unsterile water, had caused a bacterial infection that progressed to gas gangrene, a condition that was well known at the time, that is fortunately becoming a curiosity in medicine today. Gas gangrene that spread from the buttock to the rest of the body, leading to swelling and bursting in affected tissues. The team who practiced the injections had to barricade themselves. It was unclear whether they were arrested or protected by the police, or both. A tree was cut across the road to prevent them to flee. Angry mobs gathered around the hospitals, throwing stones. Telegrams were sent in Yaoundé asking for emergency relief. And despite the arrival of a medical backup team on November 15, headed by a doctor named Constant, the so-called accident of Yokaduma resulted in a total of more 300 cases of gangrene and 32 deaths at the scale of one single village, which may be one of the most violent medical catastrophes in African history. I have known that accident because of the archives it left behind. Yokaduma was and still is at least 2 days of travel away from Yaoundé, the capital of Cameroon, when the road is okay. When the rescue team arrived in 1954 with penicillin and sulfa drugs to treat the gangrenes, most victims, to put it brutally, were done dying. Much of the efforts of the colonial administration and of the colonial health service then were devoted to documenting the disaster rather than rescuing anybody. This documentary machine left a thick file in the National Archives of Yaoundé, assembling all the reports, telegrams, press cuttings, and verbatim of debates at the local assembly related to the accidents. The main aim of that documentary activity was obvious. It was to diagnose the cause of the accident, to diagnose also the causes of the unrest that followed in Yokaduma, and to attribute responsibilities. The results of the inquiries were predictable. The infections, the gangrenes, had been caused by the contamination of the water used to prepare the injectable solution because of a broken filter. The filter was used to purify the water before it was used to be mixed with the powder to be injected. The rest followed logically. It was a sad, unpreventable accident. The indiscipline and laziness of the Cameroonian nurses who failed to check the filter were certainly to blame. Or was it, and that hypothesis actually was later preferred, was it the victims themselves who were to blame? For it was well known that they rubbed dirty mud on the site of the injection, to try and ease the pain of the injection. And that interpretation of the accident was the interpretation that remained in the medical literature for years. The angry mobs, according to the reports, had been irrational, very predictable too. The French head of region and the French doctors of the rescue team had acted with sang-froid and decency, amputating legs and soothing the pain of the dying. Note that the African doctor who cared for most of the victims since the first hours of the catastrophe was simply absent from the report. Grieving families were given more money than they had ever hoped following the accident, and all the Christian victims, the reports noted, were able to receive the succor of religion by the care of the Cameroonian abbot before they died. Neither the principles nor the methods of Lomidinization were in question. It was simply a matter in the future of giving the team the means of achieving perfect asepsis. The reassurance was complete. The population trusts in the administration and in justice, the reports precised. The population was very touched by the gesture of the High Commissioner in Cameroon who gave the money to the families. And the population has asked that he be thanked. In other words, the colonial order of things was back on its feet. It had been destabilized during the few hours when corpses were piling up at the hospital of Yokaduma. The last words that closed the official report of the High Commissioner of Cameroon to Paris, sent on December 31, reinstated the colonial order of things for good. In conclusion, this sad affair could be restored to the proportions of an unfortunate accident. But the reports also tell another story that is written in their margins, in their repetitions, in the cross-out words, in the stamps put on the documents. These archives, if we follow Hans Stoller, if we engage with them not only through their content, but also through their form, made possible to escape the reading that the reports seek to impose, the story of a technical incident resolved by colonial reason and strength. It is possible to feel the pulse of the archives that reveal what I call the affective insecurity of a dying colonialism. Then it provides a glimpse of the fear that took hold of its agents, colonial doctors, colonial authorities, High Commissioner, etc. When, on the morning of November 15, 3 days after the accident, the head of the health service in Cameroon, in Yaoundé, received the first telegram of alert from Yokaduma, his first reaction was anger. How could the chief regional officer have transmitted such sensitive information without encrypting the telegram to make it secret? He immediately made his way to the Directorate of Political and Administrative Affairs in order to, he said, using an administrative euphemism, express his astonishment upon receiving a plain text message containing such serious and as yet unconfirmed news. That reply to the chief of region in Yokaduma was the first official reaction of the administration to the accident. The telegram was later stamped confidential in red, and all subsequent correspondences and reports about Yokaduma would be crypted or classified as confidential or secret. What was looming was a public scandal, and the documentary frenzy of the administration reflects the anxiety of officials and their nervous, impossible effort to contain the scandal. But on November 15, the news had already been made public, and it was soon discussed by local politicians in Yaoundé, in the Cameroonian and in the French press, in Belgium, and here in New York at the French delegation at the United Nations. So the evening of November 15 was a paradoxical moment. Just as the news was made public, the administration tried to keep it secret. The confidentialization thus played a performative role. The administration was trying to convince itself that there was no reason to make a fuss about the accident of Yokaduma. Or was it that the secret here was not the accident, but rather that the administration was paralyzed by fear? The most obvious menace at the time was the threat of political agitation. In 1954, the nationalist party, the UPC, Union des Populations du Cameroun, the radical nationalist party, was the obsession of the French security apparatus in Cameroon, and the risk that they used the accident against the French administration, for example, by making a declaration at the UN in New York, this was perceived as a major threat. But the panic was not only about publicity and politics, but also, and that's my interpretation, about the drug itself, and about the sequence of decisions that led to the accident. First, in 1954, it was increasingly clear that Lomidine, when used in prevention as a prophylaxis, a drug, the drug, just to be extremely clear with that, in Gribi and elsewhere in Africa, was used on healthy subjects who had no parasites to protect them against the potential infection. It was increasingly clear in 1954 that preventive Lomidine was a risky drug because it caused frequent painful side effects, including hypoglycemia, faintings, cardiac problems, leading regularly to sudden deaths. And that was a risk clear enough to lead the producer of the drug, Specia, the French firm Specia, to launch a special investigation in Cameroon in 1953. And the conclusions of the investigation blamed the victim for their indiscipline, especially for eating before the injections when they were told not to. But the risk was also clear enough to lead authorities in French Africa to strongly discourage the use of the wonder drug that was frequently called a vaccine against sleeping sickness, although it was a chemoprophylaxis against sleeping sickness. So the French authority discouraged the use of the drug as a prevention for European patients. Yes, that's that document. For European patients. Because of the risks of cardiac and renal incidents. And if the guidelines precised, if a European subjects really wants that injection of the wonder drug, the injection should be given by the doctor in chief after a written consent and a full clinical exam, including renal and cardiac exam. At the same time, the injections of Lomidine were compulsory for African subjects in Cameroon and elsewhere in French colonies. In 1954, it was also becoming clear that the drug sometimes failed to protect individuals against infections. But the collective effect on the herd were so spectacular, according to the doctors, that this hesitation about the real efficiency of the drug as a protection were brushed aside, as was the fact that no one could explain at the time how a drug could protect an individual for up to 2 years. Lomidine worked, maybe not for the good reasons, but it worked as a racial medicine for Africans understood as a collective body. But more importantly, in the case of Yokaduma, there were rising concerns about the extreme risks linked to the use of unsterile solutions prepared on the field with whatever water the team could find locally. And ironically, the archives of the accident of Yokaduma were shelved together with other similar accidents that happened before and after that, caused by contamination of solution by germs causing gangrenes. The reports written about Yokaduma make no single mention of the existence of other accidents except for this telegram sent by Dr. Constant, who was from the rescue team in Yokaduma, who mentioned that a similar accident, who also caused a dozen of deaths, had happened the year before, 100 kilometers away in Gabon. That risk linked to the preparation of solution from bulk powder was also clear enough to lead Specia, the producer of the drug, to officially forbid the use of bulk powder to health services a few months before the Yokaduma accident. But that awareness of the risk, that secret awareness of the risk, coexisted with official interpretations blaming victims for the mud they rubbed on the site of injections. Reading the reports of those accidents side by side makes for a painful reading. And it is clear that the accident of Yokaduma, when one reads all the warnings sent, especially by the producer of the drug, it is clear that the accident of Yokaduma happened in slow motion. The most fascinating is the strange response of the sleeping sickness experts in the French colonies and beyond, in the Belgian Congo, for example, the response to the accident. The campaigns were initially interrupted after the catastrophe of Yokaduma, but experts soon stated that they had to be restarted as soon as possible, for what was at stake was the ultimate demonstration of the positive aspects of colonialism, to use an anachronism, the eradication of sleeping sickness, the most mythical disease, the most mythical of tropical diseases. It seems that the accidents and the failures only made the doctors more certain, more convinced that the campaigns had to be accelerated till the end. And this decision, I quote, because we consciously sacrifice individuals in the front of the collective problems which has to be solved, it was because the drug was dangerous that the campaigns had to be accelerated so that we get rid of the problems, the doctor would say. And they were making this choice not because they were foolish, but because the rational and racial calculation of costs and benefits made it an obvious choice. The so-called Lomidine file began to be assembled as an archival file when, on December 2nd, 1954, the High Commission in Yaoundé requested by a confidential note that the Directorate of Political Affairs put together a very complete file on the events in Yokaduma, including a copy of the debates at the local assembly and including the reports of the various figures who wrote about the topic. That file made it easy for me to research the story and made it easy for me to tell it today as I told it to you. I owe this as much to the fear of the administration as to its political calculations, its will to both anticipate the scandal and to bury the file, in the literal sense of the term, to ensure that this affair was over. In an apt meditation on archives, Achille Mbembe wrote that archives constitute a type of sepulchre, an apparatus aiming to ensure that the dead do not stir up disorder in the present. Archiving is a kind of interment, laying something in a coffin, if not to rest, then at least to consign elements of that life which could not be destroyed purely and simply, wrote Achille Mbembe. For the High Commission in Yaoundé, the act of archiving was indeed a means of keeping ghosts silent, of gathering the remains left by the dead of Yokaduma to counteract, I quote Mbembe, the possibility always there that left to themselves, they might eventually acquire a life of their own. Archiving was a way to prevent the past from remaining present in other forms, as scandal, as memory, as rumor. In the remaining time, I'd like to see with you how this past, it's a picture from Yokaduma, how this past remained present, how it persisted in memories and bodies, and how the dead, in some ways, never ceased to stir up disorder in the present. I begin this archaeological exploration of the remains of the Yokaduma accident with a very Parisian, very Saint-Germain-des-Prés anecdote, since I know this course is about French Francophone literature. So one day in 2013, before this book was finished, I got attracted in a Saint-Germain-des-Prés bookshop by the latest novel of Paul Constant that was published in 2013, C'est fort la France. I opened the book in the bookshop and I could not put it down, for its main plot line was the story of a medical accident occurring in East Cameroon and caused by a drug named in the novel Lomidine. For a moment, I thought, and it was despairing, that some young novelist had just found out my PhD thesis, which was already somewhere in a library, and rewrote it as a novel. And now my scoop was turned into a Gallimard novel. I then understood that Paul Constant was a notable novelist who had received the Goncourt Prize in 1999. And I also understood quickly that she was the daughter of Dr. Constant, the first French doctor who arrived in Yokaduma as part of the rescue team. The accident of Yokaduma remained a traumatic story in the Constant family, and a story that Paul Constant, chain smoker father, would tell only in allusions at the end of family meals. It was the beginning of a long story of friendship with Paul Constant that I make short here. But it's a story that led me to go on the traces of her childhood in East Cameroon, traces that she never ceased to explore in her own novels. And it's also a story that led us to reflect together on the way we both kept on making circles in our careers around Yokaduma, electrifying our narratives with the forces of death and denial that were unleashed that day of November 1954. I could also tell you about other memories, this time in Yokaduma, that we have recently collected, but that would be a bit too early for me to tell you about that fieldwork in Yokaduma. What I'd like to end with is the story that led me in the first place to the archives in Yaoundé and to this file, a day of September 2003, 10 years before I met Paul Constant. I was at the time a doctoral student working on the history of the Pasteur Institute in Cameroon, a former colonial outpost of the Pasteur Institute in Paris. I was the official historian of this large research laboratory, and the local virologists working in the institute, whom I had interviewed several times as an ethnographer, the local virologists came to me with a question. They were researching an epidemiological puzzle, which you will see is very much linked to the history of colonial medicine in Cameroon. That puzzle was the epidemic of hepatitis C in Cameroon. Hepatitis C, or HCV, is a virus that was discovered in the late 1980s in the wake of HIV, and you know that the discoverers of HCV, hepatitis C virus, have received this year the Nobel Prize for this. It's a virus that has been circulated in human population for centuries, that is exclusively transmitted by blood. And this virus is one of the major causes of liver cancer globally. It's a virus that has provoked, you certainly know, major epidemics in the US and in France among intravenous drug users. They came to me with that puzzle. The age profile that you see on the slide, the age profile of HCV in Cameroon was strange. The virus infected heavily in certain regions elderly people, aged more than 40 or 50 or 60 at the time, with very strong differences between ethnies and between regions. And you can see that by the different curve. Each curve is a different region. More than this, the virologists were able, because these different regions had been sampled at different moments in time, they were able to plot the prevalence of HCV, not with age, but with the date of birth. And it's a kind of a eureka moment, because suddenly the curves align. In other words, it shows that the profile was not linked with age, but with the date of birth, which is a different thing. It's a crucial difference, because it means that the age profile of the infection was not caused by a structure of social transmission that would operate in a perpetual present, but was linked to an individual historical event, which produced what the epidemiologist calls a cohort effect. In other words, this profile showed that HCV infection in Cameroon could be a biological scar of history, of a precise moment. And this is why they came to me and asked me to look into the archives, what could have happened that was linked to blood exposures that may explain that people born before 1960, before the independence of Cameroon, would be much more infected by this virus than the younger generations. So I went to the archives, I found the Lomidine file, and I came back to tell them my answer, which was, it's complicated. More seriously, we have worked together with that team for now more than 10 years on a scenario that resemble, we have worked together and been able to show also, not only with epidemiological data, but with the genetic, the tools of phylogenetic analysis that enable to infer the demographic history of a population of virus from the analysis of the sequences of the genetic sequences of the virus. And you know that from the shape of the tree, you can infer the history of the growth of the population. And what the data from Cameroon shows, the data from contemporary viruses in Cameroon shows, is that hepatitis C underwent exponential transmission depending on the subtypes of hepatitis C in the mid-20th century or slightly later in Cameroon. In other words, it could be, again, the trace of a specific historical event. So we had immediately in mind a textbook case in the field of hepatitis C, which is the case of Egypt, where it has been demonstrated. Egypt is the country in the world with the highest prevalence of hepatitis C, and it has been demonstrated that campaigns to eradicate schistosomiasis, bilharziasis, a parasitic disease that were conducted until the 1980s in Egypt, it has been shown that these campaigns led to the massive infection of the Egyptian population in the region where that disease was endemic, led to the massive infection with hepatitis C virus, which was transmitted by unsterile injections from one person to another during these injection campaigns. And by analogy, we began to look at possible events in Cameroon that may explain a similar pattern. And obviously, we immediately thought about sleeping sickness campaigns, including Lomidinization. And recently, we conducted another study using a national representative sample of the Cameroonian population who had been sampled randomly, who had been sampled blood randomly. And we found a correlation, an association between the exposure to medical care in the 1950s and the infection with hepatitis C among elderly people. In other words, we have now robust evidence that the medicalization of Cameroon in the colonial period, including a large-scale campaign, but also in dispensaries, was the occasion of massive transmission of hepatitis C in the population. The accidents, such as Yokaduma accidents, then are extremely important events, not as events of transmission. There's no reason to think that hepatitis C was transmitted more in this kind of settings than in a dispensary, for example, but because these accidents led to investigations, as I have shown, that document very precisely the practical routines of what the nurses did, how they washed the syringes, how many they had, etc., etc. In other words, these accidents give access, open a window for historians on the daily routines of these campaigns. And they showed that the sleeping sickness campaigns, with injections repeated at high cadency, with needles and syringes and drug containers systematically reused, with their very ambitious aims in terms of coverage and repetition of campaigns, but with limited means and sometimes dubious technical and ethical practices, we have now evidence that they were retrospectively at high risk of transmission of viruses. This also, a study like the study of the accident of Yokaduma, also reveals that the rules of practice were not only insufficient to potentially control the spread of pathogens, but that they were routinely and consciously broken for matters of cost efficiency, and also that these rules were broken for matters of racialized calculations. At this point, you may have guessed that these biohistorical studies are not only important to understand the HCV epidemic, but also because hepatitis C virus is a reliable marker of iatrogenic transmission, the transmission by the iatros, by the doctor, the transmission of pathogen by a doctor, which is, of course, a major question mark in the history of another set of blood-borne viruses, which are the HIV viruses causing the AIDS pandemic. You may know that HIVs, several HIVs began to circulate in the human population in the vast zone of southeastern Cameroon that includes Yokaduma, a region where progenitors of HIV-1 were endemic among chimpanzees population. And we have now strong evidence that these HIVs may have benefited from similar conditions of mass transmission through medical campaigns as hepatitis C. As a conclusion, looking at the emergence of HIV through the microhistory of the colonial accidents, enabled to relate it to specific historical and environmental conditions, making a virus like HCV or HIV appear as one aspect of an African Anthropocene, as a ruin of empire perhaps, that can be understood by placing it in a wider multi-species historical ecology, to borrow from Anna Tsing. A multi-species historical ecology that would include rubber vines, tsetse flies, colonial doctors, medical technologies, drugs like pentamidine, and blood-borne viruses. 3 words of conclusion now. First, I will not leave you with a bold and stupid suggestion, such as, for those who are waking up, such as Lomidine caused HIV. I am not even convinced that Lomidine was a bad drug. The drug worked, albeit for the wrong reasons, and it remains useful today for sleeping sickness when it is accessible to African health services, which is not a given. What is important for me to tell you is that I don't want to flatten this story in a moral structure of hubris and nemesis, as if the epidemics of today were the prices paid for some natural and ethical transgressions in the past. Because I think the story is less grandiose, is more mediocre, is more convivial also. This story was told to me in Cameroon with laughs and songs and sadness. It is a history where stupidity, or more accurately, betise, played a role. But more importantly, I don't want to tell this story as a too human strategy, as a too much human strategy. Again, the history of us messing up everything as always. What the tracing of pathogens and the fabulous tools of biohistory also tell us is that other beings and other presences were at play, steering disorder in our lives. They were nested in the grande histoire of men and wars. I think it's a timely story that invites us to look at our dear Anthropocene, not just as a period of geophysical change and biological destruction and bodily and earthly intoxication, but also through the bugs that proliferate in the cracks and fault lines of our new era, inviting us to see, and I follow here Jen Gabris, how the materialities we are involved in making are sites not just of responsibility and concern, but also of ongoing, if often problematic, invention. And I would add, of the inventions of life itself. And I am done.
Thank you very much, Guillaume, for that wonderful talk and these important thoughts to conclude. And I especially appreciated the bringing of the talk right up to the present and to very, very pressing concerns today. We have a first question that actually deals with the afterlives of Lomidine. I should say we have about 25 minutes for questions. So if you do want to ask Guillaume a question, please either raise your hand virtually or put the question in the chat box and tell me if you actually want to ask that question yourself. The first question from Daniel Thys is about whether Lomidine and pentamidine is still in use today. Has the potential toxicity been further evaluated? I mean, you kind of began to answer the question a little bit towards the end of the talk, and there's a very interesting twist in the book with the connection to HIV and AIDS and your own sort of field work in London, in Dagenham, right, which is a place that I know well. So if you want to say a few things about those afterlives too, please do.
Yes, Lomidine is still used today for sleeping sickness, and it's a drug that had a second life at the beginning of the HIV epidemic, because it's a good drug to treat and prevent the pneumonia that was initially the first sign of AIDS that was detected in the US, the pneumocystis pneumonia. So Lomidine, pentamidine was reused after having been almost abandoned in the 60s and 70s. And the HIV epidemic opened a huge new market for the drug. So the French producers decided to re-patent it and to increase the price considerably, which made it inaccessible to African states who needed it for sleeping sickness. And so Sanofi eventually decided to generously set up a philanthropic foundation to give pentamidine to Africa, which is still more or less functioning now through the Drug for Neglected Disease initiative, which is still giving access, fortunately, and it's a good thing, to pentamidine for sleeping sickness. Pentamidine is still useful for sleeping sickness as a treatment. That is, for people who are infected with the parasite, it's a good drug, and it has a good cost-benefit, risk-benefit balance, because sleeping sickness is potentially a fatal disease. The risk-benefit balance from the 1960s was totally disfavorable in terms of using it as a prevention. No one would dare to do this from the 1960s because the toxicity of the drug has been recognized since. And today, you cannot get a shot of pentamidine outside of a hospital because the risks of cardiac incidents are too high. It's a bit like hydroxychloroquine, by the way. It's this kind of useful old tropical medicine drug, but that are, and pentamidine more than hydroxychloroquine, potentially problematic for the heart and for the kidneys. And so you have to be extremely careful with that. So as a consensus, it's a risky drug, and it's inefficient as a prevention.
Great, thank you. And I think one of the really not clever but wonderful points that the book makes is that it was partly successful, but for the wrong reasons, right? The whole sort of it's not a clear cut. It works, it doesn't work, which is very much a situation that we find ourselves in today. It's just it's mind-boggling to lots of people. Why can't we actually establish what works and what doesn't work quite as we tend to think science functions, right?
Mm.
I have a second question from Connor Wilkinson here, who wonders whether in your ethnographic, archival, and or epidemiological research, you have discovered significant disparities in health outcomes among different ethnic groups in Cameroon, e.g. Bantu versus Ubangi or autochtones. Also, did medical professionals distinguish between these groups, or did they classify everyone as generic African? And I think this speaks to the very important middle chapter on the racialization, right, of Lomidine. So I want, if maybe you can give us a few details about that.
Yeah, it's first thing, colonial medicine was practiced and imagined as a medicine practiced at the scale of the so-called races, of the so-called ethnies. So it was the entity that was treated, that was Lomidinized, was, for example, the Mbimu or the Bamileke. And so it was really, there was this imagination that tribes were somewhere on the map, and what you would treat on the map was this collective called an ethnie or a tribe. So this rationality was very much present. And then what is striking today in the present is, for example, if you look at hepatitis C, there are very strong disparities, even in the same locations, between different ethnic groups. And typically the so-called, and it's not a politically correct word, even in Cameroon, but the so-called pygmies that we call the Baka in East Cameroon, are very much less infection with hepatitis C than the population, the Bantu populations living in the same areas. And one explanation for that is that in the colonial period, the pygmies, the Baka, were not targeted by the campaigns. Because they were not accessible to the colonial health services, they were not living along the road. So they had a very different exposure to colonial medicine that may be traceable today through their very much less frequent infection with hepatitis C. So it's an example of the long-term effects of this ethnicization of medicine in the colonial context.
Thank you. I think there's an opening for me to ask a question, and I'll encourage also our students who have been reading your book studiously and have been preparing questions to begin to formulate them, and they can start asking them now if they want to. But while they do that, let me maybe also bring in another really fascinating sort of ending sting at the end of the tale, let's say, in your book, which is the acknowledgements in which you suddenly reveal to us. I mean, this is a little bit of a spoiler alert, I suppose. So if you are going to read the book and you don't want to hear this, you can put your fingers in your ears right now. But you tell us that when the book, before it came out or as it was coming out, the book was blacklisted by the Académie Française de Médecine, or sort of the major French medical academy, as a book that kind of sullied the memory of French doctors who had devoted themselves to the improvement of life, of people's life, and the betterment, that colonization obviously was, well, without necessarily caricaturing it like that, but in any case, these are people who had devoted themselves to the practice of medicine in difficult tropical circumstances, etc., and that this book sort of disrespected them. And obviously this, I think, connects to what you were saying before about the silencing of the archives and the sort of erasing, but obviously that it still is so, that it should still be so problematic to accept this today, 50, 60 years after the end of colonialism is indicative, and especially given that your book isn't, you know, a sort of moralizing, clear judgment. These are all bad people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And granted, they probably hadn't read the book when they emitted this judgment. But I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the politics of this book, your own, and the reception in France, and perhaps, I don't know if you think it might be a bit different in America, or maybe not. I don't know. But any thoughts about this?
Well, the truth is, it was a surprise that the reactions from the French National Academy of Medicine had been so strong, because but I guess with the French colonial neurosis, you're never done with surprises. It was surprising, and I mean, some of the first thing is that the former colonial medical profession, I mean, colonial doctors remain colonial doctors for 20 years after the independencies. So we had something that people may not understood, but after the independencies, the part of the colonial army, the doctors of the colonial army, remained in Africa as so-called coopérants, as aid workers, but they were still military, still part of the colonial army, and still calling themselves colonial. So we had the colonial history after the independencies. And so that is to say that this professional body remained organized until the 1980s, and also remained strongly tied by commemorations and a culture of, you know, singing songs and meeting every summer in Toulon. And so there were those rituals. And so it's a strong collective. Many of them were friendly to me and helped me all through my researches. And sometimes the same became very critical. But some of them were quite aggressive and came to conferences I gave to confront me. And so it was surprising to feel the strength of this professional body. And in a way, they were not fighting for the memory of colonialism, but they were really fighting for their own professional identity. And they were influential enough at the French Academy of Medicine to have this press release on my book out. But I also say in the book that it's true that this story is a bit unfair, because it's really a story that stings. That it's a very difficult story to bear as a colonial doctor, because they did many other things. They treated hundreds, and I mean, you could tell another story of colonial medicine. This one is an anecdote. It's a very tough anecdote. And they were happy to leave it forgotten. And it's true that I was surprised as I worked on it that so few has been written on this episode of Lomidinization. And all the historiography of colonial medicine in Africa is about the interwar period and all these very spectacular campaigns that produced little results, but nothing on the great successes of Lomidinization and of the great also disasters of Lomidinization.
Great, thank you. I think Madeleine has some questions.
Thank you, Guillaume, for this talk and for your book, which is so interesting and thought-provoking. I'm hoping maybe to draw you out a little bit on two of the central, crucial dimensions of your thinking in this book. I don't know if I would call them exactly theoretical, cores of the book, but maybe one is about the status of the archive. You talk a lot about that and about your the affinities between your thinking and Anne Stoller's idea of thinking along the grain of the archive rather than against the grain. So not thinking about archiving exactly as a mode of silencing, but as a having a function, performing something. So I was interested in that, but at the same time, there's a kind of, you perform a kind of archaeology, I think, an industrial archaeology with your visits to various abandoned or repurposed factories and sites of pharmaceutical production that, suggests, a digging, digging deep into this this somewhat marginalized, if not repressed history. So I'm curious about how you are thinking about the archives, in light of all of the different dimensions of the project. And then the second question is about, so early in the book, you emphasize that this is not going to be a book about the seamless operation of a biomedical, biopolitical system functioning in pure rationality, in a purely rationalistic mode, but rather about its failures, its mess ups, its errors, its bêtises. And of course, I'm thinking about different theoretical models that do similar work. One of them being the Parasite of Michel Serres, the aptly named, Parasite, in which, the parasite is this bug in the system, and it's a limitation of the system, but it is also what makes the system possible on some level. It assures a kind of continued functioning of a system while it's also undermining it. And I'm wondering if you share that vision of the relationship between let's say biopower and its parasites, or if maybe you are thinking about that relationship in slightly different terms than someone like Serres, for example. Sorry, those are rather convoluted questions, and if you want to just take one, it's also fine.
No, I mean, thank you very much. I've never thought about this through Michel Serres, so I will think about it, and I really take this as a suggestion. And I think in my case, this attention to the mess up and the failures is really something I think that comes from being in Cameroon on the field and asking old people about their memories of colonial medicine. And even in Yokaduma, you don't find tragic stories of colonial domination putting people in lines. I mean, you find terrible stories of death, etc., but that have an element of ridicule in it, or I mean that are on a totally different plan than this story of either of domination or of rationalization. And so in a way it's a very Cameroonian critique, and that's why Achille Mbembe is so inspiring in that respect. A very Cameroonian critique of biopower as never happening. The story of medicine in Cameroon is that there are no drugs, and that the doctor is not here, is in the capital doing something else. So you always confront the ghost of colonial medicine is empty. I mean, so it was an effort to try to rethink a critique of biopower through its emptiness. And but I totally think about what you suggest. And yeah, this question of our archive it's something that came at the end of the work, and that then became very important in my other works and in the next book. But I think in the case of sleeping sickness, what was also fascinating was the importance of documentary work in the very practice of the campaigns. The campaigns were about paper, and obviously at the end you had an injection, but before that you had a long queue to get registers and stamped and measured and named. And in many of these peripheric places like Yokaduma, the only census was the sleeping sickness census. And so there was lots of looping effects between archive and materiality and the reality, and performative effects of archiving on reality. And I think that was the beginning of trying to think about archive a bit differently. And I think, to me, just to end with that, I think looking at archives as actors of the story was very useful in terms of narration. I'm not sure it's true historically, but you've seen the way I presented the talk today, is that I need to tell the story of the files in this story because they are part of the story. So in a way, it was a questioning about how to tell the story that also led me back to thinking about the role that these archives played.
Thank you. Madeleine, was there another question you wanted to ask? I don't have anybody else on my list right now, unless somebody from the class who's been preparing. Well, actually, wait, I do have a question from Joël Abirached. Can I just read it out? Always a pleasure to listen to you, Guillaume. I was surprised and intrigued to see that you are now exploring exploring phylogenetic and other biohistorical tools as a means to explore the history of hepatitis C in Africa. I was wondering if you could tell us more about these methods. What are the epistemological questions that you find problematic or challenging? Perhaps could you speak to the limits they pose and the advantages they offer? So I was also very intrigued by that, and I will sort of tag on to that a separate question, but related, I think, which I was struck by the amount of you'll talk about the affects of these institutions. There's this clear sense of how the fears of the doctors that it's not working and it needs to be countered, or the excitement and the noise, the parasites need to be put aside because this is working and we're going for it good. And so a very, very different set of sort of at the opposite spectrum, let's say, from the quantitative biohistorical tools that Joël's talking about, this more this very ephemeral, difficult to measure, but affective dimension that I felt was quite important in your talk. So I don't know if you want to speak to either of those or both of those. Because they raise different epistemological challenges, I think, of how do you bring them into, I mean, one of them, what I was thinking more of, I think, speaks to the narrative dimension of what you're trying to present. But
yeah, thank you. Maybe, I mean, your question is the most difficult, I'd say, to answer, because
let's keep it for afterwards. Focus on Joël, then maybe the biohistorical.
And yeah, and it's a question of research, it's a question of writing, and I think obviously literature, I mean, is I'd not say an inspiration, but a contamination. And obviously, I mean, you were right to read Céline, I mean, who wrote about Cameroon, colonial Cameroon at length, and it's hard not to read it and then tell the story of a great biopower machine, and it just does not fit with the Célinian nihilism, and I think there's this contamination from literature that, as a historian, you need to be attentive to these kind of affects and sensibilities that are there in the record of literature, that are there in oral memories, that are tangible almost, but that are often absent from. I mean, it's a bit of a straw man, obviously, to say that they are totally absent from the historiography, but I think it's a critique, at least that I really had in mind at the time of writing this book. But that I also explore in the next book a lot, maybe in a less affirmative way. I make more hypotheses about affects instead of attaching one to the story. I explore the idea of telling the story with different moods and not being able to sort out which is the right mood. And then I think phylogeny is an extremely exciting field. I've worked for a long time with these teams of virologists, and I was only the historian giving them a few a few paragraphs for their papers without really understanding what was at play. And as years go, I am more and more trained in the field, and I can understand what's at stake and all the assumptions that are not very stable into that. But what I really like, I mean, almost poetically in phylogeny, is that you can infer history from a set of contemporary samples. And it's what's fascinating in living beings, that is that in their genetic sequences, at any time you have a record of the past. In their mutual relationship. In a phylogenetic tree, you not only have the relationship between the present beings, but also a record of the past. And it's something that is literally archaeological, and that the theory of archaeology, I think of Laurent Olivier, especially in France, has explored this affinity between Darwinian biology and archaeology in the relationship between the past and present. And I think that's what very poetical about this use of phylogeny. And then practically, there's lots of issues, lots of misunderstandings between historians and virologists about what a date mean and what all this, and how stable is all this dating. But I won't enter into that, but that's a big issue. And of course, we need to talk to each other to sort out these misunderstandings.
Great, thank you very much. The public part of our conversation comes to an end here. The students in class do not run away. We still have you for half an hour. And so we will see you in a breakout room very soon. I just wanted to take the opportunity again to thank all those of you who joined in, who listened to the talk today. And thank you once again to Shani and Fanny and the Maison Française for hosting us. Please do come again for other forthcoming events. You can look up at the Maison's events page on their website. There are lots of exciting things, albeit on Zoom, in the forthcoming days, including our next talk for this course with Véronique Dadjo on December 1st. But I don't know, Shani, do you need to say anything? Do you want to say anything in conclusion?
No, I think that's it. I just want to thank Guillaume and thank you, Thomas, for doing a great job as moderator. And that's it. I think you've touched on all the other bases. So thank you so much.
Well, okay, well, thank you all. Goodbye to everybody who can leave now. The class, we will see you in the breakout room. And thank you again.
I stay in the room, right?
Guillaume, you should be receiving the invitation for the breakout.
Yes,
Yes,
okay.
Okay, you can join that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shani. Thank you, Fanny.